And kicking off our afternoon, I feel like he needs no introduction at React Rally, but the one and only Kent C. Dodds will be giving us a talk on managing state management. Just in case you don't already know Kent, he is a speaker, he's a teacher, he's a trainer, he's an open source maintainer, he's all over the place. He does so much cool stuff. He teaches on Egghead.io and Front End Masters. He has also created epicreact.dev and testingjavascript.com. And he just makes these amazing videos. And we're about to watch a really fabulous talk. So, everybody, please welcome the virtual edition of Kent C. Dodds.
Hi friends, my name is Kenzie Dodds and I am so excited to be talking with you virtually for React Rally in cyberspace. I'm really grateful to Matt and Jameson for putting on this conference each and every year, and I'm glad that they didn't postpone this and that we're doing it just virtually during this really weird time. So I'm excited to be talking with you today about managing state management. It's a topic that I think a lot of people are interested in, so I'm excited to jump into it with you right now. Let's go. So here's a link to my slides, and I'll have a link to this at the end of the slides here for you to go through and look at some of the links that I've got in the talk. I've got some information about me and some links and things, but the only thing that I really want to talk about specifically before we get started is Epic React. You can find that at epicreact.dev, but this is going to be released very soon, and it is an enormous amount of material on React, and it's really geared toward you mastering this wonderful framework that we love called React. So please take some time and check out epicreact.dev. It is awesome. I've spent a silly amount of time on creating this thing for you because I just love React and I want you to help me make the world a better place using it. So what this talk is, I'm going to be talking about how application state management doesn't have to be as difficult as we make it, and how thinking about state can make a major impact on the maintenance of your application. So it's about maintenance. There's also a little bit about performance in here. You might not need anything other than just React for your UI state, and bringing in a bunch of libraries to help you solve state problems can actually incur more costs than benefits. So that's what I'm going to try and talk about today. I do want to avoid being dogmatic here because my problems are not your problems, but I think that there's enough of a problem overlap for us that we should be able to come to a pretty good agreement on what things make sense for most cases. So that's my goal here. And here's answers to questions that I know you're just dying to ask, so feel free to take a look at those later. State management. It is a hard problem. So let's talk about state in general. State is basically data that changes over time. And anytime you add time to really anything, it complicates like everything. It makes it so much more difficult. So like consider the like historical data, like what what the temperature was yesterday, or whatever the case may be for historical data. That is data. That is not changing. It has happened. There's no reason for it to change. You can cache it forever. It's not a problem. But if we're talking about the forecast of what the temperature is going to be today, that is state, because that's going to change the closer and closer we get to that time. And so that is something that changes over time, and then it converts into data when we pass by it. Most of the stuff that we're dealing with when we're building applications is going to be state. Sure, there are some of you out there who are building graphs and stuff of historical data and numbers or whatever. That's fine, that's great. But we deal with state a lot. Like the modal is open state, or in Netflix, the time that the user has gone through the video. Or, there are so many elements of state in our applications. That is really what makes our applications useful, is this state. And because it's such a hard problem, we often over-engineer the solution because we feel like a hard problem deserves a hard solution. And my assertion is that you actually don't need to solve this with a really complicated, over-engineered solution. What you need to do is think about it correctly. And so the first thing that I want to convince you of is that server cache is not the same thing as UI state. And by separating these two things, you drastically simplify your management of the UI state. So let's talk about the cache for a second. Server cache is basically state that is actually stored, persisted on the server, and then we access it in the client inside of a cache. And the reason that we do this is because if every single time the Netflix wanted to go and get the user's current time position, every single time if they wanted to hit the server to get that information, that would be a bit of a performance problem. And so they kind of synchronize those two things. Or if every single time I wanted to look at my tweets, rather than accessing the cache that Twitter has, they would just go to the back end for every single tweet that I'm going to look at, then yeah, that would probably not be super great. Now, that means that we make the trade-off of not always being correct, so maybe they don't always have the right number of favorites on those tweets or something, but we are making that trade-off of correctness for performance and stability of both our server as well as the client and whoever's using our application. And so we implement this cache so that we don't have to hit the server as much. Now, that is very different from UI state, which is state that's only useful for the UI for controlling interactive parts of our app. So think of modal is open state, or the status of open or closed. Or like the current value of an input that isn't actually saved until the user hits submit. Different things like that. That is UI state, and that does not need to be persisted to the server. I'm recommending using React for UI state, and then you can use a library for a server cache. React doesn't really have a solution for server cache. You can use React, like useState and context and stuff for your server cache. That works fine. And in fact, I recommend using React Query, and that's what React Query does. But I'm a strong proponent of React Query. I think it is just nailed the nail on the head for giving you all the right knobs for controlling that cache, because some things need to be cached longer than others. Like, for example, the cache for the forecast in 10 days, that temperature for that 10-day forecast, yeah, we can cache that for multiple hours probably, but for the forecast of the temperature in 2 or 3 hours, probably don't want to cache that for so long, right? So React Query gives us the right knobs to twist for how we want to treat our cache, and then we can just leave all that off to React Query for managing the server cache, and then our UI state can be managed just completely by React, all by its lonesome self. So let's, with that in mind, let's just think about our UI state for the rest of the time here. This is an example component tree. You can think of this as like a Twitter-like app. And so here you have your app. You have your left nav that's rendering a bunch of links and a drop-down, a button, some main content, and your tweet information here. And then the right side, the controls there, the search. So what in here would be global? Like, what would make sense to be global? Now, aside from the server cache stuff where you've got your timeline and tweets, your users' information, that's technically a server cache. Authentication is a bit of a unique case where you technically are storing it as a server cache, but you And you probably could use React Query to manage that. But I personally have my own authentication provider, and that's the kind of thing that would be like an app-wide thing, right? So I would render that as part of the app because a lot of things are going to need it. Like the link needs to know who the current logged in user is to be able to link to the right profile. The dropdown maybe has special things based on the user's roles or responsibilities. The timeline, that like tweet input, needs to know whose avatar to show. And so yeah, that's definitely one of those things that should probably be global. But something that wouldn't make any sense to be global is the is open state of this dropdown, right? There's nothing else in this component tree that needs to know whether the dropdown is currently open or not. And so different things like that, or the current value of the tweet input, that could probably be local state as well. And so like keeping that in mind and what should be global and what should be local, I think is a really important concept and something that we should follow. So I've seen applications and I've built applications where we added a state management solution, not React, we've installed something, and because we had that, we just kind of assumed we'd throw everything in there into that state management solution. I don't recommend that idea. I think putting state where it belongs and keeping it located where it goes is a really good idea. And when you do that and you've used React Query or something for your server cache, then you can just use React for your state management library. It's the one you don't have to yarn add or npm install or bower install or unpackage script tag or whatever it is, because you already have it in your React application. And that is with React use state, or, I'm a fan of use reducer as well. And here's a really contrived example. You've got your counter. I like using the counter because it shows the API without too much noise. We have our use state. We have our initial value here. We have our state and a mechanism for updating the state. We call that, we get that current value, and then we add 1 to it. And it works out really nicely. And the question that you always get is, well, okay, yeah, sure, that works for a single component. But what if I need to share it between multiple components? And this is a tale as old as time, where you have some state and then you need to access that state in a sibling component. For that, the solution in React has always been to lift state up. And so we have this app and we're rendering that counter, but now we want to have a count display that will display the value of that count. So we just have two components that need to share some state. And so the solution to this is, rather than like trying to synchronize state or something like that, you just find the least common parent between the two components that need to share some state, and then you move the state to that least common parent. So our least common parent is this app component. So I'm going to take both of these and move these to the app. And then I'm going to take my counter and I'll have a count, and I'll add a prop called on increment click increment. And then we'll take that on increment click and the count, and we'll pass that on increment click to the button. So now, as far as the user is concerned, we've just refactored this code. Like there are some like subtle differences in the way that things operate, but for the most part, as far as the user is concerned, this was a refactor. This doesn't change any of the behavior for the user. And so with moving the state up to the app, now we can pass it down to the count display. So we can say count is count, and we can accept that as a prop. Now we're off to the races and our users are happy. They can access the count everywhere. I think we're pretty good at doing this in general as a community. But one thing that I think we're not quite as good at is responding to changes, which are like, that's the only consistent thing that we have in this world is change. And responding to the changes that in requirements that our business people bring to us. So let's say that they changed the count display component and we no longer need access to the state. This kind of thing happens all the time. This is pretty contrived, but hopefully you can envision in your mind a situation where a component no longer needs access to the state that it did before. So now we can say, that's a nice count value you got there. Okay, so we no longer need the count, so we'll remove that prop. And this is where we typically stop. Maybe sometimes you'll go through and you'll say, oh, okay, well, we don't need that prop anymore. I don't want to pass more props than is necessary. Sometimes I will do that, but this is definitely where we stop most of the time. And I suggest that we take this a step further so that we can simplify our application state management as well as improve performance of our application in some instances by co-locating the state. So you'll notice that now our counter component is the only thing that needs access to the state and the mechanism for updating the state. And so we can actually just move this directly to that component. And maybe you wouldn't be able to move it directly to one component. You'd move it to one that passes it on to several others. But you don't have, like, if you just lifted state all the time, then all of your state would eventually end up in your app. And that's not good for maintenance or for performance. And so if we try really hard to just move state to where it needs to be, then we can improve the maintenance of our applications. So now we no longer need to accept those as props, and we can rename this back to increment. And voila, we're actually basically back to where we were before. But that's the general idea is when you have some state that needs to be shared, you lift that state up. And then if that state no longer needs to be shared, then you can push that state back down and co-locate it. So that's another recommendation that I make or that I want to give you to simplify the management of your state in your application. So often a criticism that I see when we talk about lifting state is like, well, okay, yeah, but what about the prop drilling problem? And this is actually one area where I think that Redux really shined, and it made solving the prop drilling problem really easy. It's like, well, you don't need to worry about prop drilling because now you just put all of your state in Redux and you can access it anywhere in the world. And let's not get ahead of ourselves, though. The prop drilling problem is basically the situation where you say, I've got some state that I've lifted up, and then there are like 3 levels of components that I need to send those props down into before I get to a component that actually cares about it. Or maybe all of them care, but I do have to send that state down through a couple levels of components. I actually don't see this as a problem. That's why I put problem in quotes here, because I actually see this as a benefit because it's actually easy to trace. You're like, okay, so this component passes this thing, and maybe easy is the wrong term, because once you go a certain number of levels, then it, like, you got 30 tabs open in your editor. But in general, it's direct, and you can trace it statically. So long as you're not just doing stuff like, let's combine all the props and more props and like onto forever. Now, that is probably not a great practice. I wouldn't recommend doing that. But prop drilling by itself is not a problem, but it can be a problem. And I think the first line of defense to avoid the prop drilling problem is to use composition. So often we write our components like this, where we say, okay, I'm going to render this header, and that header is going to be responsible for this. And oh, one of the components of the header needs access to the state that needs to be shared. So we have that state in our app, and we'll pass that here, and then the header will prop drill it to wherever it needs to go. And then we have our left nav, pretty much the same story. We'll prop drill that to wherever it needs to go. But maybe instead of having, like, this is something that's pretty common where you draw boxes around parts of your UI, and that actually works out really nicely. That's one of the cool things about React. But maybe instead of drawing a box and say, okay, this thing is all by itself, just responsible for the header and everything in it, maybe it could just be like, this header is the layout, and then I'm going to stick the logo here, and I'm going to stick, or this is what the logo is going to be. The header can be responsible for where it goes. Here's what the settings is going to be, and the header can be responsible for laying that out. And that's basically like view slots, but React has had this since day one. Like, this has always been a thing you can do with React. And it's basically just composition. So header accepts a logo prop, and we say, here's the logo component, and here's all the props that it needs. Now we don't need the header to prop drill anything. We just say, header, this is the logo element that I want you to send to your logo position. And then same with the settings or whatever else that the header is rendering. Or you can also take this approach for the left nav, where you say, here are all of the elements for this nav. And these components just end up being responsible for laying things out where they go. And so then you can really avoid this prop drilling problem in doing that. If you want to dive a little bit deeper into this, then I strongly advise taking a look at Michael Jackson's great video about composition. It's super good. And then this is also in the documentation. I think it's been there forever. So you can read up on composition with React in the docs. So take a look at that. Sometimes composition's not going to do it for you. Most of the time, context is something that libraries should be using, but there are definitely situations like authentication or something like that where it makes a lot of sense for you to use context yourself. And in those cases, that's a great way to solve the prop drilling problem. So we've got this example here that we had before. And if I did not want to do any sort of prop passing whatsoever, so we're no longer passing the count or the on increment click anymore, then how do these components get access to their stuff? We're going to use context. So let's get rid of this. And I'm going to create my counter context with React create context. And then down here, I'll say counter context provider. And we'll close that off there. And I'll say my value is an object that has the count and set count. Or maybe we'll just pass in increment. And then we'll put our count display and our counter right in there. And now all the elements that are children of this provider will have access to the provided context value. So what context is it's basically a way to say, hey, React, I've got this value. I want you to put it in a box for retrieval later. And then React's like, okay, I'll hang on to that for you. And then some other component somewhere down in the tree says, hey, React, you know that box that you've got? I want access to that value. So React says, okay, here you go. And the way that those components indicate to React that they need access is by using the React use context hook. And then we pass in the context value, or the context object itself. So counter context. And that's going to get me back my value, which is this object. And so I can just destructure those properties from that object. And now I have increment, and I no longer need to accept those props. And so now we don't need to do any sort of prop drilling. No matter how far it is in the React tree, I can access it anywhere. And then we can do the same thing in this one, and we can avoid that prop drilling. Now, again, I would really recommend that you avoid using context to solve simple prop drilling problems and focus first on composition. And even if composition's not quite enough and you do have to pass something a couple levels, is a couple levels really worth adding this extra complexity of context? I don't think so. So focus on composition first. If it really becomes an issue, then you can jump into context. I would suggest that probably every application has one or two use cases for context directly, and then most of the other use cases are reserved for libraries. And we'll talk about those a little bit more later. So if you want to dive in a little bit deeper on how to use React context effectively, I've got a blog post about that, so you can check out the link in the slides here later on. So another thing I want to talk about is co-location of your providers. So you are going to probably be using libraries. You'll have a router. Maybe you're using CSS and JS, and so you'll want a theme provider potentially. Maybe you've written your own authentication provider. Maybe you've got a user and all of this. So you've got a bunch of providers. And often when we think provider, we just think global. It's just kind of the default. And I want to explain why that's not a great default and how that hurts maintenance and even performance of our applications. So typically when we make things global like this, our file structure tends to follow that same path. And so this is not a recommended file structure, by the way, just an example of what would probably come out of something like this. So you'd have that code in your index, and then you'd have a providers directory, and then you'd have your screens and all the components for that, maybe utils and maybe a lib or whatever. But yeah, so you've got all your provider components in here in the providers. And the problem with this kind of a structure is that, what if the only component that cares about this notifications provider was this notification screen? That's the only thing that actually cares about it. Well, wouldn't it be nice if we just put notifications directly in there? But we don't do that because it's rendered at the root of our application. But if that's the case, then maybe we don't need to render it at the root of our application. If the only thing that cares about it is our notification screen, then why don't we just render it with the notification screen? So that's what we're going to do. Let's co-locate this. And instead, we only render the global stuff that actually needs to be global. And then the rest of the stuff can be local. So within our notification screen, we can put that notifications provider. The user screen, maybe that's the only thing that needs this user provider. Whatever it is that you're doing, let's co-locate not only the state, but also the providers of that state when you are using context. And the natural thing that happens out of this is that now we're going to put our provider within the notifications, and we'll have a provider for our user, and whatever, however you want to do this. And again, this is not a necessarily a recommendation of your file structure. You can take a look at this thing Dan made for how to do file structure in React apps. But yeah, the cool thing about this is that code splitting just works. Like, you don't need to even worry about code splitting. You can say, hey, I'm not going to load the notifications code until the user has actually gone to the notifications page. And so that means that all of the logic that you've got, the libraries, whatever you're using for that provider can actually be code split. Whereas if they're rendered at the root, you can't code split that stuff. That has to be sent with the user like before they can see anything in your app. And so like there are performance implications there. It's also maintainability implications as well, because once it's co-located, now if I'm making changes, I just hang out in this notifications directory and I don't have to worry about anything else. And then actually there's like a legit cognitive load that comes when you're maintaining stuff and you're working alongside files and code that is irrelevant to what you're trying to accomplish. It makes you nervous that you're going to break something. Like, can I get a CSS reference here? But so like we're trying to co-locate stuff so that we can isolate these different concerns. So all of my concern around notifications is all in one place. So the file structure scales really well because like you can have a million things and your provider directory doesn't just explode because of the millions of things that you have in there. And you have reduced indirection because you're just in one place and it's easier to follow the logic of things that are going on. And sometimes you are going to have global stuff and like we can embrace that and accept that. But most of the time you should be okay with just co-locating things as closely as possible. And honestly, global is still co-located because if it's actually needed by pretty much everything, then yeah, that's still technically co-located. That's just as close as it could possibly be, which is global. So finally, I know that some of you who build like really complicated applications with really complicated UIs have a vein popping in your forehead, like, what about performance? So let me just say that if you follow the aforementioned advice, then most of you will not have performance problems. There are some of you who are building those really complicated UIs that are struggling with performance of state management with React, and you're like, I need to have something that is not React to manage my state, which is totally cool. If that is you, then I suggest Recoil. Now, I'll preface this by saying I've never built anything and shipped it to production with Recoil. So there's that to keep in mind. But I have investigated it and played around with it enough to know that I think it's a good solution and it can help you solve some of your performance problems. So what I'd recommend is if you are having some performance issues and you've already followed the advice that I've given previously to this slide, then take a look at Recoil, and there's that video that introduces Recoil. You can watch that, and if the problem that they describe is similar to the problem that you're having, then Recoil is a good solution for you. So in review, React is a state management library, and your server cache is not the same as UI state. And so for your server cache, use React Query, and then the UI state just becomes infinitely easier when those two things are separate. So focus on lifting state up, and don't forget to lift it down or push it back down with co-location. Use composition when prop drilling is a pain, and sometimes you can use context. And if perf is an issue, then use Recoil. And this will help you both with maintenance as well as performance in your applications. And I think you'll enjoy that. And that's all I have for you. Thank you all very much, and I'll see you on the interwebs. Tweet! Goodbye.
Well, thank you so much, Kent. I mean, could anybody but Kent C. Dodds manage to state how to manage your state management in React so well? I can't imagine that anyone could. Thank you so much for kicking off our afternoon, Kent.